All right. Yeah, feel free to drop in the chat just how you're doing. Give us a status update. And if you have any different access needs today, please let us know. Again, I'm Thomas. I'm joining from Occupied Lonely Land in the East Bay of the so-called East Bay of California. It's great to see everyone. I was just talking with Chica a little bit about the translation that you all have. We've been reading this passage from Marx on original accumulation slash primitive accumulation for a while now, and it's interesting what some of the changes in the verbiage do to the effect of some of the language. There's a section in which Marx is talking about original accumulation by the colonial powers, particularly Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. And at the end of it, in the original translation, it said that force is the midwife for every society or something to that effect, pregnant with a new one. And in the new translation, it's violence is the midwife of every society, pregnant with a new one. It is, in fact, a kind of economic power. And so, it's there's some, interesting changes here that actually we feel have punched up the effect of what Marx is trying to convey today. We've, started our study together in our first week, talking about Marx and his time, place, and conditions. And then last week, we sort of laid down the foundation for political economy and talked about wage exploitation as the sort of driving mechanic or mechanism for capitalism. And what we're going to dive in today in the second section on political economy with Justin Leroy is primitive slash original accumulation, right? And so this is both touching upon this idea of how the transition to capitalism was accomplished and how it is continually being brought into being. Something that struck me from reading it again this time was that very terrible section, or the multiple terrible sections on the sort of exploitation and violence that was undertaken by the colonial powers, both in Asia and Africa and South America, but also in and across the Americas rather, but also at the very end, the section on child labor and child exploitation and the sort of breadth of violence that he articulates. That's really horrifying to sort of think about, just the sort of stealing of children from families and working them to death and the kind of miserable conditions under which they were being exploited in order to make this transition into the capitalist system expedited. And it also struck me that we're in a period in which we are being horrified, or have been horrified on a regular basis, by the violence against children during this war in Palestine, but also in places that are now finally getting a little bit more coverage, like the Congo, where there has been the exploitation of children, both through war and through, most importantly, capitalist expropriation for a long period of time. Um, and part of what we are going to cover here is that this process of primitive or original accumulation is an ongoing process. And so the question we have to sort of constantly be asking ourselves in thinking about this base and superstructure kind of framework that Marx has given us for understanding political economy is how is the what's happening in the superstructure, right? Expediting, whether that's through the violence of the state, or obfuscating, whether that's through the media or the legal system, or our understanding of values and mores of the day, what's actually happening underneath in the capitalist economic base, which has always been a exploitative and violent and horrifying ordeal for the working class and the working poor communities of the world. And so what we're going to do today is Chica is going to start us off with just a little bit of review for of last week's kind of key concepts. And then we'll do that for about 20, 30 minutes. And then we'll be joined by Justin, and that'll be a treat. And we'll walk through the readings today, talking about our original accumulation and racial capitalism. So again, great to see everyone. I know some of you just joined. We've just been recapping a little bit and talking a little bit about what we're going to cover today. And without further ado, I'm going to head it over to you, Chica, to get us started on our review.
Thank you, Thomas. And thanks everyone for being here today. It's very good to be in this space with you all after an just incredibly exhausting week. This can feel demoralizing to observe and do our best to resist the just absolutely stunning developments that we've been seeing as far as climate disaster, as far as war, imperialist oppression, you name it, it's all coming to a head, it feels like. And yeah, just want to recognize that that can feel so hard. I have felt that this week. And so that's here with us as we begin our study into how we can better understand and work to dismantle this just awful, oppressive system of capitalism. All right, so as Thomas said, I will be taking us through a bit of review from our key concepts last week. I spent a little bit of time studying over the various questions and comments that you all placed into the chat last week, which were just excellent. I hope I can address some of the questions that seem like they kept popping up. If you find that you have something, lingering or some point of confusion, feel free to stop me. We have a little bit of time this morning so that we can get into it and try to really get ourselves grounded in the terminology, in the concepts before we go forward. So keep that in mind. You are welcome to ask your questions either by unmuting or by placing something in the chat, and I'll try to monitor that chat. Let me go into some slides. I'll share my screen with you here. Okay, I'm in the middle here. Let's go back. That's forward. Here's back. Okay, so we looked at political economy, part 1 last week, which was about capital and labor. So, and if you're reading those emails that we send out after every class, great. This will be so helpful for you and just consolidating the knowledge, hoping you'll gain from the class. We sent you 6 big ideas last week, which is a lot. And so these are them in brief, and we'll walk through some of the major points. So we talked about the way that Marx revolutionized the study of political economy. We also took a look at base and superstructure and how the two elements are in a dynamic relationship, although we generally view the economic base as being the dominant force in that relationship. We also talked about surplus value and how surplus value, or also thought of as profit, is basically the engine that powers capitalism, capitalist production. We talked about labor power being the capacity that a worker, we'll say the labor power being the capacity that any person has, and that in the production of goods and services, that power is exploited, which leads to alienation. So we didn't talk too much about alienation last week. I'll get into it a little more with y'all this morning. We spoke about wage exploitation. This is a key concept. This is a key process within capitalist production. And we touched on reproductive labor, but hopefully we can get a little deeper into it today because it is an important Marxist concept. Okay, so we'll start with just a little bit of review of political economy. And I'm realizing I need to open up the chat so that I can see it while y'all are, how can I do this? Sorry. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. All right, so just a few a few ideas we'll look at here with political economy. Let's start here with base and superstructure. So this image is just such a helpful teaching tool and device for helping us understand this relationship. When we talk about political economy, we are talking about the way in which a society is, or how do I want to say this? That we can look at our economic study as not just being based on the sort of production of goods and services, but also has some kind of relationship and there's some kind of importance in the social production as well. So the educational system, the cultural production, all of this has some relationship to bear on how we understand the economic system we live in. And this is a point that I know that I made at least once before, that capitalism is not just an economic system, but it's also a social system, right? And I think we all experience that on various levels, but here's a way that we can understand it together. So we see in the bottom of the diagram the means of production, the economic relations, we could call that the relations of production. And if I ask you all this question, I wonder if you can help each other remember, if we put together the forces of production and the relations of production, what does that equal? If we try to make a kind of equation, forces of production plus relations of production. Is that meaningful to you all? Does that ring any bells? Do we know? Anybody?
Some folks are dropping in the chat mode of production. Chico.
Great. That's what I wanted. Thank you. Yeah, somehow I opened up the chat, but then I lost it. Let me see if I can keep it open. I don't know. I can't. Okay, so annoying. I think I can do this if I put this screen over here. You all can still see the slides, right?
We can see them.
Okay, great. Just sorry for the trouble. I'm just gonna see if I can make a workaround happen here. Yeah, okay, so the mode of production. So the mode of production is this whole bottom half of this circle. Yeah. That's the mode of production, is the system of production, the way that goods are produced, the capitalist system in our current times. Okay, and so we can look at this and think a little bit about the forces of production, or sometimes called the productive forces. That's made up of the workers, the labor power, and the means of production. And then the relations of production are the relationships that we enter into, which are involuntary, that are how we produce and reproduce the means of production in society. So under capitalism, we have bourgeoisie and proletariat. That's a relationship of bosses and workers. And that is just one example of an economic base in one kind of mode of production. And if I ask you all, who controls the means of production under capitalism, what would you say?
Capitalists.
The
Great.
bourgeoisie.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we understand that. Yeah, so that's who's determining how production goes in this society. And I just wanted to dial in a little bit on means of production. Can folks name some examples of means of production? There's a few here on the slide. Tools, technology, equipment. What else? Or what kinds of examples can you think of these forms? Okay, I see factories, land, absolutely. A cotton gin, absolutely. Yeah. Property, great. And then there's a few others here. So intellectual property, I think can be means of production if it's something that's required to produce a good or a service. Absolutely. People, gonna I think I'm going to dissuade us from thinking about people as means of production. People are indeed important in producing goods and services, but let's make a distinction between the forces of production and the relations of production. So the people are in relation to production, but they're not production itself. Um, does that make sense? Is that okay if we make that distinction? I can see, Natasha, why you put people there because obviously people are required to produce. But when we talk about something like, you know, the Communist Manifesto encouraging workers to seize the means of production, it's not really about seizing control over other people. It's about seizing control over such things as factories, machinery, um, specialized equipment, land, taking it back from capitalist control. Okay, great. So let's keep it moving. All right, so now let's look at production under capitalism, which we talked about some of these key terms, wage exploitation, surplus value, and we'll talk a little more about alienation today. Okay, so we did talk quite a bit about surplus value being the thing that helps power the whole capitalist system, that capitalists are able to take more value from workers than they have to pay the workers within this system. And we saw that within capitalism, workers are laboring in a way that some of their labor is paid and some of their labor is unpaid. And it's the unpaid part that generates what's called surplus value. So here is a picture of workers at a Foxconn factory. Foxconn is the company that assembles iPhones. And we had you read for last time this piece by the Tricontinental Institute that detailed the production of the iPhone 10. Does anybody remember what was the surplus value or what they called the rate of exploitation, more or less, from the making of the iPhone 10? What did folks remember about that? Like, was it a lot? Was it a little? It was so much. Yeah, it was a shocking amount. I don't remember the amount. 1,000%. It was more than 1,000%, actually. Yeah,
I want to
shocking.
say, was it like 30,000 or something? It was like
Yeah,
some
so
ridiculous
it
number.
yeah, there were many, many ridiculous numbers in that article. It's just stunning. So $30,000 is the number that these researchers sort of predicted that the iPhone would actually retail at if it were produced in the United States with prevailing wages that we make in the US. But the surplus value of an iPhone that's sold at $999 was $603. And the way they calculated the amount was that it was 2,458% is the rate of exploitation, which is basically just to say the surplus value amount is 2,500%. Yeah, so a little over 2,000%. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty surprising, isn't it? In the example we had from Marx last week, we're talking about a yarn spinner in a factory in England in the 1860s who's making, 3 shillings out of the 6 shillings that he's producing for the capitalist. So that rate was something like 100%, like 3 shillings, 3 shillings. And here we had workers making, I don't know, like $25 or something like that, and the iPhone selling for about 1,000. So just to put some numbers on this, one of the ideas that we can get from that article is that the capitalist is always engaged in a drive to create more and more surplus value, more and more profit. I prefer the term surplus value over profit because it does actually indicate this process by which the worker has created extra value that the capitalist then takes. But that this process kind of intensifies over time, that capitalists need to increase the value they're capturing from their workers. And they do that in a bunch of different ways. They may intensify the work, speed it up. They may try to lengthen the working day or the working week. All these various means by which they can extract greater and greater value from the labor of their workers. All right, and we talked about labor power. Labor power is the capacity to work in a general sense. We know that workers are selling their labor power as a commodity, and as a commodity, labor power generates more value than it costs, which is where the surplus comes from. Labor power has these various different elements to it, including whatever is required to maintain a worker's life, to reproduce that worker's life, food, clothing, shelter, etc., whatever training, education, skills the worker acquired, and the generation that's coming up that will replace that worker eventually. So everything that's required to care for a worker's life and reproduce a worker's life is part of their labor power. We know that under capitalism, the workers don't determine how they use their labor power, right? Like somebody else is in charge of that. The ones who control the means of production are in charge of that. And so we get this process of alienation. Alienation, we can say, is the separation of an actor or an agent from any kind of meaningful agency. So this is a condition that stems from the separation or estrangement of producers from the means of production, which is to say, workers don't have control of the factories, the land, the machines, etc. And this leads to the inability of human beings under capitalism to determine for ourselves how we use our labor, our time, and how we relate with each other and society. Okay, so people may have, we may have some familiarity with the idea of alienation of labor, that the work that we do is not really determined by us. So the time that we spend is controlled by someone else, right? And within the Marxist analysis, this has implications for us as workers, but it also has implications for us as human beings and how we relate to the world, how we relate to each other. Alienation is a very deep condition, and it's something that we want to abolish with the abolition of capitalism. All right, and so let's just talk a little bit about reproductive labor. Reproductive labor, we could say, keeps the whole capitalist system running. I mean, would keep any system running, but within capitalism, it has a special nature. Okay, so this is the labor that goes into keeping ourselves alive. It also helps us produce other generations of workers. Reproductive labor does produce surplus value, even when it's not waged. So to think a little bit more about this, I wanted to just introduce us, if we don't already know her, to Silvia Federici. Silvia Federici is an extremely accomplished and respected Marxist feminist, activist, writer, teacher. She is a co-founder of the International Feminist Collective, which launched the Wages for Housework campaign in the 1970s. She's from Italy, and it's an international campaign that women basically in the second wave feminist movement, radical women began to agitate and organize for this demand that housework become paid labor within the capitalist system. And she's still involved in causes such as that. She's also well known for her book that came out in the early 2000s, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation. So she's talking about the ways that capitalist accumulation depends on a kind of extraction from the labor of women that's unpaid, and that has a extremely violent history. Okay. Anybody familiar with Silvia Federici? Is she somebody folks have heard of before? Or she's well known in anarchist circles as well as being having a Marxist background. All right, so here is a quote. It's a little bit of an excerpt from a relatively recent article about Silvia Federici's work and especially her work on the Wages for Housework campaign. I'm gonna read it and then ask us all to think a little bit about it. The struggle for the wage is at the same time a struggle against the wage, for the power it expresses and against the capitalist relation it embodies, Federici writes. When people who are not paid for their work start asking for pay, they're often told there simply isn't enough money to meet their demands. What becomes clear is that neither private businesses nor public entities can afford to pay for all the unpaid work done in society. If the system operated logically, it could not stand. The demand for a wage reveals, too, that no one's wages are adequate for the work they do, that no one's life should be sacrificed to work. We have always belonged to capital every moment of our lives, Federici writes in italics, and it is time that we make capital pay for every moment of it. Okay, so this is taken from an article that's a pretty recent piece. We'll send you in the post-class email. But I wanted to just get folks' take on this and, ask a little bit, like, what are your thoughts on this idea of a strategy of sort of making an impossible demand that would actually collapse the system? And also, like, what would it mean to make capital pay in our current moment? And I see there's a couple things in the chat. Let me check out what's here. Okay, I'm not aware of this. Thanks, Romeo, for this comment about work being trans-exclusionary. I haven't seen that before, but I'll look into it. Yeah, and Julie, I like your question here about how would the wages for housework be considered within the equality of wages versus abolition of the wage system argument from last week. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that we talked last week about the way that, Marx has this argument that the demand for an equality of wages within a capitalist system is in some way sort of nonsensical, that you can't get it. And I think that this demand for wages to be paid for housework, for what we might now today call care work, for reproductive labor, to be paid is also what it does is it kind of points to the limitations of the system. Like, where would the money come from? Who's supposed to pay it? By what means? How does one qualify for it? There are these various elements that are not exactly unanswerable, but very, very confusing within the capitalist system. And yeah, I don't know how I want to weigh in on like effectiveness or those kinds of questions. But I think there is a similarity. There is a kind of through line there where we're talking about a need to create better conditions for people under capitalism, questions about how do we make people's lives better? And also, we have to, at the same time, understand that it is the capitalist system that impoverishes us, that alienates us, and sort of needs to be abolished. So those are things that are in tension I think, in many of our struggles, that we're within a system, but we want to abolish the system. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and we could just talk for a few minutes before our guest joins us. I guess it's a dialectic. That's right, Julie. Exactly. And we'll talk more about that next week. Yeah, and I see your comment here, Natasha. My grandmother never worked, yet she contributed to this society by making sure her husband and children were taken care of and prepared to enter the capitalist system. That's a very nice encapsulation of what we mean by reproductive labor. Reproductive labor is completely essential to the functioning of this capitalist system, right? And I think, reproductive labor, whether or not it's a familiar term, I think many of us are familiar with the idea of care work. It's essentially the same. Like, we're talking about what is it that allows us to stay alive, to flourish in various ways. Yeah, and so this is very, very important, and it's not waged in this system, right? So this is an important intervention that Marxist feminists were making and continue to make, actually. Okay, Rebecca, your question about was this wages for housework movement mainly a kind of sarcastic ploy to point out the kinds of inconsistencies in the system, or were there proponents who were really in earnest? That is a great question. I am not sure. I don't know. My sense is that people were really actually making revolutionary demands because they wanted the system to change. But I'm not like super well versed in the movement struggle of that time. So I'm not certain quite how they were thinking about it among themselves. Like, if they thought they could really achieve it or not, I don't know. Yeah, and I like your comment, Seo, here about who's seen as valuable or not within capitalism. And yeah, and yes, this does highlight the absurdity of wages altogether. So yeah, so I think we understand what some of the aims of the movement were. Okay. Great. So these are wonderful comments. Thanks for engaging with that and thinking about that. And let me ask, before we transition to our next piece of class, if there are any questions about what we went over last week or this brief recap today. Okay, Rebecca, a little bit more about why labor is the only commodity that generates more value than it costs. Intuitively, it makes sense, but not sure you understand the flow of the logic. Okay, sure. So we talked a lot about surplus value. Surplus value is the answer here. The fact that workers can labor and generate value, but then only take some of that value back home with them. Is that helpful? Or do you need to hear a little more about that?
I think that's helpful. I think it's just like hard for me to wrap my head around like every other form of commodity like has the same, I guess that there's like a parity of some sort between the value generated.
Yeah, within Marx's analysis, other commodities, they get their value from the labor that workers are putting into them to transform some kind of natural environment or natural material into something that can be sold as a product, something that has use for someone else. And so the value is generated through labor. If we understand that that's the source of value, then it makes a little more sense that when we're talking about a person, the source of that labor, then the value that can be generated is a little bit more or has a little bit more potential, because we know labor power is this capacity to labor. And so the capacity to labor is what the capitalist takes advantage of. They can take the value generated by all that labor and only pay the worker for some. But the rest is still there. All that value has been created. and it goes back to the capitalist rather than to the worker. So we have to understand that value comes from labor, and so that's why labor power has this particular quality. This is the only one commodity that's actually coming from our human capacities, which are exploited under capitalism. Okay. All right, great question. Very helpful for us to keep coming back to those main points so we make sure we understand together. All right. Okay, I think we're doing all right on time here. And I see Justin has joined the group. Hi, Justin. So let's just have we'll turn it over to Justin Leroy, who will walk us through the readings for today. Justin is an expert in racial capitalism and a professor at, I'm actually forgetting your university, Justin. You're in North Carolina. I know this.
Yeah, I'm at Duke. I've just been here for a couple of years though.
Right. Yeah. And Justin used to live in the Bay Area and used to help us teach this class in person back before the pandemic when we had in-person sessions. So he's been part of this understanding racial capitalism part of political economy for quite a number of years at this point and has been a very good comrade to CPE. Justin is the one who put us onto this new translation of Marx. And we're just so grateful for your participation and your continued willingness to come show up here and help us out with understanding some of these thorny concepts. So thank you, Justin, and welcome.
Hi everyone. It's great to be here as always, and it's great to see such a large group. Um, okay, if you just bear with me for a second, I'll get our uh, slideshow started. Okay. All right. Can everyone see that okay? All right. Okay, so our goal for today is to kind of go over the concepts from the readings you did for today, but in a kind of interactive and discussion-based way. So I invite you all to feel comfortable jumping into the conversation at any point by using the raise hand function in Zoom, or if you don't want to actually speak, then you can type a question or comment into the chat as well. I think I have a new setup going today that will make it a little bit easier for me to keep track of all of that, but it's likely I'll miss some hands or comments. So I'll just ask Chica and Thomas to let me know when someone would like to ask a question or make a comment if it seems like I missed something. Okay. So just it sounds like you were doing some review when I jumped on, but just as a kind of refresher, according to Marx, how do capitalists accumulate wealth? Just sort of broadly speaking, and in simple terms. Okay, I see. Exploiting the labor of others, exploitation, stealing. Um, yeah, can I like this idea, this language of stealing. Can someone say a little bit more about that? How does an employer steal from an employee? Low wages, slave labor, by not paying them fully for their labor. Yeah, I mean, all of this, I think, gets at exactly what we're talking about. A capitalist makes wealth by selling the commodity or the thing that a laborer makes for more than they pay a worker to produce it. And so it's a little bit more complex than that, but everything that you all have thrown out basically captures this. For this basic dynamic to work, a few things have to be in place already, right? In order for employers to exploit their laborers, there need to be large amounts of capital in play. There needs to be a small group of employers with exclusive control over that capital. And then there also has to be a laboring population willing to sell their labor. But capital hasn't always existed. People haven't always hired themselves out to employers for wages. So how did we get to a point where the majority of people have to sell their labor to a small number of capitalists just to survive? The last section of Capital, which you read a couple of chapters from for today, is Marx's attempt to answer this question of how we got here to this kind of capitalist social and employment dynamic. And very early on in the section that you read, Marx writes, this whole process, and by the whole process, he means these capitalist social dynamics where employers exploit workers. This whole process thus seems to imply that capitalist accumulation must be preceded by an original accumulation, an accumulation that doesn't stem from capitalist production, but instead serves as its starting point. So original accumulation has something to do with the origin of capitalism. And so we're going to spend the first part of our time together trying to figure out what Marx meant by original accumulation and how it fits into his larger understanding of capitalism. So in a minute, we're going to split you up into groups, and I'd like you to spend about 12 minutes discussing these questions. What does Marx mean by original accumulation? Why is it important to his understanding of capitalism, right? Why does he dedicate a number of chapters at the end of Capital to this concept? What examples of original accumulation does Marx provide in these chapters? And can you think of any other examples from your own experience or organizing, right? Marx has a very particular perspective as a 19th century German living in England. But once you've talked about what original accumulation is and what the dynamics are, you'll probably be able to come up with things that you've experienced or witnessed that feel similar or the same. And so we want to talk about that to kind of think about whether or not original accumulation is something that we can still sort of see going on today, or if it really is more of a historical artifact and kind of limited to the time periods that Marx wrote about. So before we split up into groups, are there any initial questions or comments or kind of clarifications about the first part of this discussion? Okay, great. So the last thing I'll say before we split up, I know that 4 questions is a lot to cover in 12 minutes, and they're not simple questions, but the goal isn't for you to kind of come back with perfect, clear answers to everything. It's more for you to have an opportunity to spend some time in small groups to think about what points you find important or interesting or confusing, and kind of set the tone for our discussion to come. Okay, So
Justin, how big do you think those groups should be?
um, about 6 people,
Okay.
5 or 6, yeah. Okay, so we will come back at 2.
Okay, great. And we'll open them now. Chica, you're muted. Let me stop the recording.
Yeah, that's what I
Um, so does any group want to volunteer to start us off, telling us what they discussed for this first question, what Marx might have meant by original accumulation? What exactly is that? Um, yeah, it's like, right, you realize that your understanding is a little bit more tenuous than you thought when you try to explain it. And I've been doing this for a long time, and even when I kind of sat down to just summarize for these slides, I had to really think about it. So you're not alone, Julie.
I can try what we talked about. So we were talking about just from the reading, um, he's explaining that it was the historical process of separating the producers from the means of production, and that it set the foundation for the current capitalist system, which, as you were saying earlier, created the structure so that wage laborers must sell their labor in order to survive, and the capitalists have the ability to exploit labor for surplus value.
Yeah. So that phrase, separating people from the means of production, is definitely a key one for Marx. It can be a little bit unclear what exactly he means by that, even if we identify it as a key phrase. But I think that was yeah, a really great way of starting the discussion. Shay, do you want to jump in?
Yes. I really had to kind of let this sit and marinate for a bit, but the way that it really kind of processes for me is that capitalists essentially sabotage the existing market to create the means for which they can acquire property, possessions, and labor from the people who are most impacted by their sabotage. Um, yeah, I'm going to leave it there before it gets too muddled.
Yeah. So this idea of sabotaging the existing market, right? So you're kind of bringing into the discussion this idea that you know, people obviously had to work and survive in some way before capitalism, and original accumulation does something to interrupt that. So you're kind of giving us a sense of movement through time. Um, do any other groups want to share some of the things that they talked about for this first question? What does Marx mean by original accumulation? Yeah, Natasha?
We didn't really talk about this, but just listening to this discussion, when I think of original accumulation, I think of like in biblical times when the people who had the most cattle were probably the most powerful. And I think about the people who had the most property. And even when America first started, like you weren't even considered a man unless you had property. But you talk about accumulation, you could accumulate cattle, you can accumulate um, animals that help you produce products and things like that. So that's what I think about now. But we kind of talked about the origins of it, and I like the example they used on one of the the things I read when they talked about how when Eve bit the apple, and it set the precedent for, everybody's going to be a sinner, so that's just, a given. And then I also think about how you talk about accumulation. When Catholicism was going against the Christians, or I can't think what Martin Luther created or whatever. I was just reading about it. But I mean, the Catholics accumulated a lot of people, and that can be a form of accumulation too. And historically, how people learn how to accumulate things.
Yeah, okay. So you've given us a couple of big ideas here, right? Kind of bringing up the idea of um, sort of ancient or pre-capitalist forms of accumulation or wealth concentration raises the question, is that an example of original accumulation, or are there kind of non-capitalist forms of economic inequality? Right? What is sort of specific to the dynamics of capitalism, even as we know kind of wealthy people and poor people have existed for much longer than capitalism. So I don't want to directly answer that now, but I think we will get to it, and we'll also get to your second point about original sin and this idea of Eve biting an apple. We'll I'll return to this in question two, because it is I think the role of kind of stories is important to Marx here. Okay, just looking at the chat for a second. Okay, Olive has written, Marx described the bourgeoisie as a revolutionary class. Was original accumulation the manner by which they accomplished their revolution? I really love that phrasing. I want to turn it back to you as a question. Like, what what about the way Marx wrote about original accumulation made this come to mind? This idea of it being a kind of bourgeois revolutionary act. Okay, and Noah responded, I think the kind of triumph of the bourgeoisie over the monarchy is what allowed them to expand original accumulation. Yeah, Olive, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks for the kind of uh, framing that question. I guess what made me think that is we're talking about original accumulation as something that like significantly disrupted the existing social order of the time, and we're talking about it going from, a system that was not that did not feature like economic equality to a different system, like a totally different system that also did not feature economic equality, but was radically disrupted by the advent of this capitalist class and by like enclosure and expropriation and this like radical disruption that it sounds to me like it is this it sounds to me like they're almost one and the same, that the as this capitalist revolution disrupted the existing social order, um, that what was happening as they did that was the accumulation of what previously was not theirs and belonged to the workers.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a great way of putting it, and I want to take what you said and put it next to something that Julie typed in the chat, which is Julie's identifying a strong degree of sort of sarcasm or irony in Marx's writing, and I think that's absolutely correct. There's a way that Marx makes fun of classical economists for treating the emergence of capitalism as a kind of inevitability. And even, well, maybe not quite today, but until relatively recently, or even now in certain kind of right-wing economic circles, there's this idea that there's something inherent to human nature that makes us want to barter and exchange, like, humans as economic creatures. And Marx just thinks that's ridiculous. And so, sort of as you said, Olive, Marx is trying to get us to think of the emergence of capitalism as a kind of very historically specific process and not something that's natural or inevitable. And if something isn't natural or inevitable, then events or people or actions have to put it into motion. And that's exactly what Marx is getting at. And I didn't put this in the slides, but one of the things that Marx writes in this chapter is that to sell your labor, you need to be free in two senses, right? You need to be you need to be free from free from anything that would prevent you from selling your labor. So you can't be a slave, you can't be a serf. And so the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of slavery within Europe itself, obviously not in the colonial world, those were necessary conditions for capitalist social relations to emerge. So this isn't, there's a lot of complexity here, and for capitalist exploitation to start to happen, that in many cases meant the erosion or end of previous forms of inequality and oppression, right? So it's Marx is starting to sketch a kind of complicated historical picture. And that probably sounds a little bit vague, but we'll get into a little bit more detail as we go on. Okay, I'm just going to take a moment to look at the chat and see if I missed anything. Yeah, so I see Samar typed in France, Haiti, and the US. I mean, I think that's such a good answer, because I think many of us can just look at those three words put next to each other and understand what you mean and the forms of exploitation that might be going on. But do you maybe want to share with the rest of the group a little bit about why this example came to mind, or what about the relationship among these three places makes you think of original accumulation? And so if I call out something you wrote with a question, you definitely don't have to jump in and answer it. It's more just an invitation if you want to, but I don't want anyone to feel like they're being put on the spot. Yeah, Noah.
Hey, yeah, I was just gonna say, I would love to, I, you know, talk about that if it's welcome. When I saw those words together, I was definitely, my mind went right to how France, how the Haitian Revolution allowed for, the ending of the first nation to have to end slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and the first Black nation, to be free of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, and then France's subsequent, forcing Haiti to pay reparations to the slave owners until the 1940s, which was like 90% of their budget, 90% of their wealth each year. And then, of course, the United States' invasion in 1915, so much. Haiti has endured so much, and has paid the price, for freeing themselves, you know, um, for over a century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Haiti is sort of the first example of the ways that post-colonial nations are often kind of trade political dispossession for economic dispossession, right? You might no longer be formally a colony, but you're still going to be under control of this, nation from the global north through debt and other forms of economic entanglement. Okay. And then Nancy shared that their group talked about uh, how plunder occurred in different places, kind of pointing out the Americas, India, Africa. Yeah, yeah. Um, this is great. I want to move on to the second question, but before we do that, I just want to make sure everyone has had a chance to share what they talked about if they want to, or ask any questions about how Marx is defining original accumulation. Okay. Um, so the sort of summary after I reviewed these chapters that I mentioned took me longer than I thought it would to kind of boil down into a sentence or two. Is that original accumulation refers to the ways that people are cut off from any means of subsistence other than working for a wage. It is how the means of production become concentrated in the hands of a small group, so everyone else has no choice but to sell their labor. Um, and one of the places that I marked where Marx is pretty explicit about this is on page 651, where he writes, "The capital relation presupposes that workers are separated from the things they need to realize their labor, in the sense that they no longer own those things. So-called original accumulation is thus nothing other than the historical process of separating the producers from the means of production. It appears as original because it constitutes the prehistory of both capital and the mode of production that goes with capital." So again, I know that the idea of workers being separated from their means of production might sound pretty abstract. And so that's why for the third question, I asked you to think about the examples that Marx uses to elaborate on this. And so we'll get to kind of what this actually looks like and what counts as being separated from means of production in a moment. But I just want to pause here and take a moment to ask what questions you have, and if anything is not clear and you want us to kind of linger here for a moment before moving on to the second question.
Could you read your summary one more time, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll send these slides to you all after, so you'll have them. Original accumulation refers to the ways that people are cut off from any means of subsistence other than working for a wage. It is how the means of production become concentrated in the hands of a small group, so everyone else has no choice but to sell their labor. Okay, so Fanny is asking like sharecropping or company towns. For now, I'm going to say like I I want to hear what you all think, and uh, I bet by the end of our discussion, we'll have started to raise similar questions and discuss this.
Oh yeah, Justin, do you mean to be sharing slides right now? I'm not seeing anything.
Oh, sorry. I think okay. Is this better?
Yeah,
Yes,
we went.
yes.
Thanks for that
Okay, I'll
question,
just
Jessica.
have to remember when we come back, I have to share the screen again. Uh, yeah, so here is my kind of summary and Marx's quotation from page 651. Okay. So we sort of have gotten a sense of what original accumulation is, this idea that it's the separation of workers from their means of production. But why does it matter, right? Marx says that this is sort of a precondition of capitalism, but it's a little bit distinct from much of what he writes about in the rest of this massive volume called Capital. So why is getting his readers to understand this important? Why should we care about the idea of original accumulation? Um, what what do you all think? How did you talk about this question?
Our group kind of talked about this as like maybe kind of like too obvious, but to understand the history of capitalism and how it was created, why, who benefits from it, to get to where we are. I mean, like in our case, like to get to where we are today, and thinking about how we can, like other ways we can live outside of capitalism, without capitalism, that is not as brutal and that benefits the most people.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's too obvious at all, right? Even today, more than 100 years after Marx was writing, it's still really difficult to come to any kind of consensus about how exactly, when, and where, and why capitalism came about. And so, yeah, I think that's really important, getting us to understand the what Marx sees as a kind of sort of true history of the origins of capitalism. Yeah. What did other groups talk about? Yeah, to help make the point that capitalism isn't an inevitable, ingrained human way of being. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think similar to that, how it's built on like a core inequality from the very start, which is kind of shapes his whole understanding of the system.
Yeah, that's another really important point. Marx is absolutely telling us that um, the origin of capitalism is in inequality, and worse, right? It's not a kind of benign or peaceful or idyllic transition. Um, yeah, so the idea that by kind of cluing us into the origin of capitalism, we might be more likely to critique it rather than just sort of unconsciously reaffirm it. Um, Gabriela says to make clear the violent beginning of capitalism versus the fable we're told of the haves and the have-nots. Yeah, 100%. That's a great way of putting it. Um, yeah, and Oya says in the chat that there's something here about the dispossession and economic disinvestment of rural communities, the creation of urban centers as a way to sever the connection of workers to their means of production that Marx was seeing in real time. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is great. You all have put some great stuff in the chat. Is there anyone else who um, wants to speak to the larger group and talk about what you discussed? Okay, I think you all are really, really spot on here. Um, and again, my summary is that this original accumulation is important to Marx because previous economic thinkers wrote about the emergence of capitalists and laborers as a simplistic morality tale of one group who was frugal and saved and came to have wealth and property, and another group that was lazy and irresponsible and was left with nothing to sell but their labor. And Marx is critical of this view because it completely erases the violence and coercion necessary to concentrate property in the hands of the few and create a pool of people willing to work for a wage. And so, you all kind of covered all of this in what you said in the chat and what you shared by speaking. But this is also why I wanted to flag the comment about the story of original sin from the Bible, right? Even if you're a very faithful person, it's maybe not so likely that you believe the literal story of Apple and Eve and biting an apple and kind of bringing sin into the world, right? But Marx is sort of saying that it seems as though a lot of philosophers and economists believe what he calls just a fairy tale about the origins of private property and the wage relation. And um, uh, I'm not sure if the phrasing is still there in this translation, but he uses the phrase insipid childishness, at least in the prior translation, to describe this dynamic. And so he really wants us to focus on the violence necessary to kind of shift the world into a set of capitalist social relations. And he does he writes about this in the first chapter that you read, but I really like this quotation from toward the end of the reading, where on page 690, where Marx writes, the expropriation of the people directly engaged in production was carried out with the most ruthless barbarism and driven by the nastiest, pettiest, most hateful and hideous passions. What was once the private property of an independent working individual, someone fused, so to speak, with the things he needs to perform his labor, is supplanted by capitalist private property, i.e., private property based on the exploitation of someone else's formerly free labor. Okay.
Justin, we have Katani has a raised hand.
Oh, yeah, Katani, please.
Thank you. And it lends to this slide about questions. I'm trying to think of the whole idea of original sin, and it reminds me of, I forget what this, I think some kind of American, I don't think they were a sociologist, but they wrote this like paper basically like on why um, you know, poor Black families are the way that they are, trying to like the problem with like the non-marital childbirth and so forth. And that like spread like wildfire in Congress, policies was informed by it and so forth. And so I'm wondering about, because obviously, like before there was capitalism, there were people. So what is it about this concept that these economists like Adam Smith and Ricardo and so put forth that was able to catch like wildfire if there wasn't already an existing struck exactly the morning Hannah. Thank you, Fanny. If there wasn't an existing structure of powerful people that would allow this to sort of take flight and, govern the economy for the world as we know it. And I know that before industrialism, there was this agrarian society and so forth. But I guess the way that I sort of reconcile this was this like just a big bang where they came in with their guns and their money and said, this is what we're doing now? Or is it because it seemed like there's something that had to sort of allow for the structure to grow as it did, because it's not like if you preach the gospel to folks who can't read or write, don't really know anything, it's not going to go very far. But if it lands on people who are powerful and are able, then of course that influence spreads. And so I'm trying to understand, just like forgive my ignorance on this, that what were the mechanisms that allowed this economic structure to spread the way that it did if there wasn't something before where there weren't rich people already and a structure already that, retained a readiness for this kind of economy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything ignorant at all in your question. I mean, and if I'm understanding you correctly, so basically, certainly by the time Marx was writing, and even by the time Adam Smith and Ricardo were writing, we're talking about the middle of the 18th century to the end of the 19th century. And so, arguably, capitalism was firmly entrenched, at least in, you know, parts of England by that time. And so the kinds of stories that Marx is making fun of, basically, they were being told after the fact, right? So we already had this structure where more and more people were being forced into wage labor. And after those dynamics had emerged, then it was these political economists looking back on the previous sort of 100 years or so and coming up with kind of very innocent justifications for why why those relationships existed, which I think uh, kind of is closely related to your question, or you're bringing up the idea of the Moynihan report, where sort of like 75 years or so after the end of slavery, kind of like deep forms of racial inequality were entrenched, and Daniel Moynihan sort of was trying to uh he was a liberal, and so kind of had a like was doing this out of what he thought were good intentions, but was trying to kind of come up with a sort of like bizarre ahistorical sociological kind of explanation for the family structures and forms of inequality he saw among Black Americans. And I think what what ties them together is Marx's critique that they refuse to kind of see the core of violence that's kind of erased in these accounts. And I think those types of narratives are probably like the types of narratives that the powerful are more likely to accept. Does that start to answer your question?
I think it does. I think I was sort of taking this idea of original sin a little more literally, thinking that we were all sort of just like kumbaya and all friends, but it wasn't like that. So the idea of sort of bringing in that context is really helpful. like colonialism had already started, by this time. And so, of course, there were mechanisms in place, and they're offering an analysis to sort of explain it away. But yeah, it's helpful. I think it just sort of lends to, more knowledge, seeking, on my end to sort of color in the picture. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think the sort of like the main core takeaway here is like Marx is criticizing how violence can be erased in origin stories. Um, and yeah, that's sort of a dynamic I think we can see in a lot of different contexts. Okay, I'm just going to take a second to catch up on the chat. Um, okay, so Noah is asking about settler colonialism, maybe in Palestine specifically, and if that counts as original accumulation. I think this is probably something that's on a lot of our minds. I'm going to defer that to um, the last part of our discussion and turn that question back to you all. We can discuss whether or not you think kind of ongoing forms of settler colonialism count as original accumulation. Um, uh, Fanny, we're going to get into examples in just a second. Um, yeah, and so Felix raises the question of like the history of guilds and the Middle Ages. So I'll say medieval history is not my specialty, and uh, but like one of the main factors, one of the main threads of the origin of the history of capitalism is certainly the rising power and influence of merchants, and particularly the ways that they kind of became economically tied to monarchs through lending monarchies and rather like the state money and things like that. Uh, yeah, I'll just say that for now, so we don't kind of go down too deep a rabbit hole. Um, And then Oya also brings the idea of slavery into the chat. And again, we'll kind of transition into that right now, I guess. Before we start discussing the examples of primitive accumulation, are there any other questions about why it's important for Marx? Okay. Um, So I can we maybe do a kind of temperature check? I know that we're at about the halfway point of today's class and you all are due for a break. So I'm happy for us to do that now. If people feel like they have a little bit more stamina, we can do it after discussing the third question. I just kind of want to be mindful of sort of where people are and energy levels.
Maybe folks can put into the chat. Do you want the break now or a little later?
Okay, so maybe we'll keep going for maybe 10 more minutes um before breaking. Okay. Um so original accumulation separates workers from the means of production. This is a violent process, but Marx still hasn't told us what specific things he's thinking of. So what examples does he provide here? What do you all come up with? Does anyone want to volunteer to share what you discussed? Or maybe you didn't get to the third question because there's a lot on your plates. Okay, I see dispossession, theft of children, colonial system, national debt, modern tax system. Yeah, great. And Noah, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was just gonna point to this paragraph that I think really sums it up a lot on page 682. It's the second paragraph where he starts off with like what characterizes the dawn of the era of capitalist production. And he talks about gold and silver and like the so-called discovery of the Americas. He talks about how India was conquered and plundered by the British, and the splitting up of Africa. I guess he doesn't point to like the 1884 Berlin Conference or anything, because I think that was probably after he was writing this. But he does talk about like Africa, and he points to uh, 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 like the wars between Netherlands and against Spain, and the Opium Wars in China or against China. So those are just a couple of examples from that part in the reading.
Yeah, no, that's a really evocative passage, and I think someone put it into the chat earlier, and it probably stood out to a lot of us. Um, yeah, I think everything that you all are throwing out is really central. Um, the examples that we all saw: colonialism, national debt, protectionism, and slavery. Um, so I think, it sounds like we sort of are starting to get a clear sense of colonialism and colonial violence and um, how that fits into original accumulation. Um, Maybe trying to drill down a little bit. If we know that original accumulation is about separating people from the means of production, how does colonialism do that? And I know that probably is maybe it sounds like really obvious or simple, but how would European colonialism sort of separate people from their means of production and be a type of original accumulation? Uh, Yahira? Sorry, is that how you pronounce your name?
It's Yahida.
Yahida.
hmm I think it's just this reinforcement of the separation, right, between people and the means of production, because it's in essence also the beginning of um what now I would, like offshoring these days, right? Where the means of production is so split up in different places that how could one person in one place think of producing for themselves in order to survive in the moment is one of the pieces that I think of in terms of colonialism.
Yeah. So who are we talking about? Um, I mean, when I think, right, the idea of offshoring, I think, is a really, really great example that we could talk about in terms of like, is original accumulation still going on today? Because when jobs in one place are kind of transferred to someplace else where an employer can pay lower wages, that sort of has this dual effect of kind of impoverishing the worker where they used to be and kind of impoverishing the worker where they're going. And so, like, I really like that example. Um, is that like, do we think that that's what Marx is talking about when he brings up these examples of colonialism? Who's being separated from their means of production? Oya wrote Dispossession of Land. Oya, do you or does anyone else want to maybe sort of say how dispossession fits into original accumulation? And I know this might sound kind of basic, but I really want to make sure that uh, we're not making any assumptions and that we're kind of on the same page about what Marx is saying here. Jessica?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm precisely answering your question, so just cut me off. But like, I guess I think we've talked about all these examples of like the violence of colonialism as it's conveyed in this chapter. And then I guess in terms of how it goes to like separating, like sort of furthering, I guess, the capitalist system. I guess what I got, there's this on page 684, there's this passage that's like, it just kind of helped me picture in my head. It's like the colonial system fostered the development of shipping and trade, ripening them fast. And then like the colonies were the site where like sort of created a market for the manufacturing of goods and accumulation. So it's sort of like all this wealth and capital that was acquired through like the violence of colonialism, through robbing people, enslaving people, seizing the land of indigenous people and genociding indigenous people, like sort of flowed back to England or wherever, is transformed into capital, which then sort of necessitates separating, um, necessitates the existence of the worker, right? Or like waged labor. I don't know if I'm getting at what you're answering, what your question was there, but that's what it made me think of.
Yeah, absolutely right. So if colonists steal land from indigenous people, that theft is separating those people from kind of means of supporting themselves through subsistence agriculture, right? Um, if uh, if colonists sort of just steal raw materials from colonized people, that is a form of accumulation that exists outside of the wage relationship, right? And so that theft is part of the dynamics of original accumulation that Marx is talking about in colonialism. Um, I saw a hand. Ian, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, it's not fully formed, but I was also thinking about how the European countries like use their like technological power and like economic power to tell other countries like what to produce and like what they would buy and what they would sell and setting up this like resource extraction where like in colonies being forced to focus on like extraction of like raw materials and like the destruction that that had on like local industry. And so the economy like all around the world being set up to feed these factories in Europe, and then the goods from those being sent back out across the world.
Yeah. So the kind of um, political power that colonial nation holds over a colony, again, sort of allows for the exertion of um, like not extra legal, but forms of like coercion, command, violence that again exist outside of the wage relationship, right? And this idea of being outside of the wage relationship is important because if we think back to the beginning of our conversation, for Marx, capitalist exploitation is based on paying workers less than the true value of their labor. But all of the various things that you all have brought up are forms of violence and exploitation that exist outside of that particular dynamic, right? And all of those things allow colonists to accumulate capital, again, in this sort of like what Marx is framing as original accumulation. Okay, so for this question of colonialism, I think several of you have pointed to this passage or parts of or passages that appear very close to this one in the text. But Marx writes, these methods relied in part on the most brutal violence. For example, the colonial system did, but they all employed the power of the state, the concentrated, organized violence of society to quicken the transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode. And then sort of related in 684, in fact, the colonies secured for the nascent manufacturing workshops both a market for their goods and accumulation boosted by market monopoly, while the treasures acquired outside Europe by directly robbing, enslaving, and murdering native people flowed back to the motherland, where they were transformed into capital. So yeah, we can sort of see through the examples that Marx provides and that you all have thrown out that there's something key here about how colonial violence creates wealth for capitalists. Okay, so why don't we take our break now before we delve into the last set of examples that Marx uses, since I don't want us to go too long without it. And is it 15 minutes, Chica?
Yeah, 15-minute break.
Okay. Great. So we'll continue this discussion in 15 minutes. Okay. It seems like people are mostly back, so we'll pick things up. All right. So one of the things I really love about these Marxism 101 groups is that everyone really adds a lot to the conversation. But I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to some of the examples of original accumulation that you all might have experienced, and we have enough time to discuss our next reading. So I'll just kind of walk us through these other examples that that Marx offers, so we can kind of turn things back to you all. So it sounds like people had a pretty solid understanding of the way that Marx was using the examples of colonialism. When it comes to national debt and protectionism, usually things kind of get a little bit murkier. And I saw in the chat a couple of people were asking for a definition of protectionism, which we'll get into in just a moment. Yeah, Marx kind of uses the idea of national debt in like a very, very specific way in this chapter, and it might be helpful if you kind of thought of it almost like money laundering in your head, right? If I was having a conversation with Chica and she said, I really want to start a business, but I don't have the startup funds for it. And I said, oh, don't worry about it. Here's $100,000. Just run with it. That's sort of just a loan between friends, and maybe no one is asking too seriously where I even got that money to be able to lend. But if you start to look into my past, you might find that I was doing some really shady things and made that money through like violence or something like that. But when when Chica reports on her taxes, $100,000 gift from friend, that's, the story's over. The way that I got the money is kind of erased from that transactional history. And Marx is sort of getting at something like that when he talks about national debt. And he gives this example on um, page 685. He writes, when national debt sprang up, so did an international credit system that often conceals the source of the original accumulation in a particular country. For example, by the beginning of the 18th century, one of Holland's main branches of business was lending enormous sums of capital, especially to England, its more powerful rival, which is now doing that for the United States. Some of the capital that arrives in the United States today with no birth certificate was just yesterday the capitalized blood of English children. And so the idea here is that, at the beginning of its industrial revolution, England employed children in factories. And in addition to the kind of horror of small children working long hours, there was the kind of danger and physical violence that they experienced through sort of lack of safety in factories and things like that. But when English companies or the English state lends money that was earned through such violence to another nation, that violence is erased because of the way that like those loans kind of Marx is sort of implying that our knowledge about such transactions kind of don't cross international borders, right? We sort of stop tracing back the history of these of this money once it crosses national borders. That's sort of what he's implying when he's giving these examples, and he really doesn't write much about national debt except for this paragraph that I've excerpted some of. And so it's not a fully fleshed out idea, but again, the gist of it is that lending between nations obscures some of the violence at the origin of those fortunes. It's a way of kind of again, like money laundering, making blood money seem clean in a sense. And I'll kind of give everyone an opportunity to ask questions once we've kind of covered the other two examples. Protectionism is something that Marx is similarly sort of brief in writing about, but kind of broadly, protectionism is like it refers to restrictions or limitations on international trade in order to support or protect domestic industries. So it's the opposite of free trade in many ways. And for example, like you might have heard a lot about Trump imposing or wanting to impose tariffs on Chinese imports in order to support US manufacturing. That is a form of protectionism, right? If another country can manufacture goods really cheaply, that makes it harder for the United States to be competitive because American workers sort of expect or need to be paid more than workers in other places. And so you impose policies to support or protect US industries. So yeah. Marx writes of policies like this, the European states not only pillaged their own people, both directly with export premiums and indirectly with protective tariffs, they also violently cleared away all industry in the dependent neighboring countries. England got rid of Ireland's wool production, for example. So wool was England's biggest export for a very long time. And so Marx is saying, this colonial relation can kind of, as someone, I think someone was saying this earlier, you can have control over your colony's production. And so that's what he is referring to here. The idea that like for Marx, tariffs are bad because instead of being able to import French, I don't know, French cheese really cheaply, I guess it would be French sugar really cheaply. You'd have to import sugar from English colonies like Barbados or Jamaica, and that might be more expensive. But since it's kind of keeping wealth within this English economic circuit, it's better for the capitalists if random English people have to pay more for their sugar, or if English people are exporting wool outside of that English circuit. If they want to send wool to France instead of North America, they have to pay a tax on those foreign exports. So both sort of very left economic thinkers and very right economic thinkers have supported protectionism at different points in time. So it doesn't necessarily have a like conservative or leftist politics like inherently, but at this moment in time, Marx is arguing that policies of protectionism are profitable to capitalists and exploitative to ordinary people. Yes. And then the last example he uses is slavery. A lot of you mentioned this, right? Like maybe 50 years before Marx was writing, England instituted some minimal child labor protections, but he sort of sees forcing children into factories as a really key sort of jumpstart to the Industrial Revolution, and he sort of puts that alongside the expansion of slavery in the United States as the two forms of slavery he sees as really essential to the origins of capitalism. I know that was kind of like fast and loose. I hope it sort of just started to give you a sense of why some of these examples were important to Marx. Let's pause here for kind of questions and thoughts. So, well, I guess I'll just say, I don't know as if it's super crucial to understand the nuts and bolts of everything Marx is writing about here, because some of it is kind of deeply embedded in his particular time and place. But I guess the main takeaway would be this sort of this passage here, right? primitive accumulation could rely on sort of overt brutal violence like colonialism and slavery, but it could also be sort of more subtle, what Marx calls the concentrated, organized violence of society to separate um, people from their means of production. So, right, original accumulation was wide ranging for Marx. It could be anything from like indigenous land theft to a particular economic policy that made basic necessities more expensive for people because they had to be bought domestically rather than imported internationally. So it's a really wide range of things. Um, yeah. Okay. Questions about Marx's writings on original accumulation? Yeah, so um, the the protectionist policy from today, again, that comes to mind is um, like I think Biden instituted tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Um, and that would be a protectionist policy because the fear is that China could manufacture electric vehicles more cheaply than in the US, and that thus the price to buy one would be lower. Um, and so if you put a tariff on those imports, it raises the price, in theory, to be equal to or higher than a domestically produced electric vehicle, therefore incentivizing Americans to purchase US-made vehicles, which supports US manufacturers. And so that's a way of kind of using economic policy to help support a domestic industry and make it more difficult to purchase internationally, if that makes sense. Felix, yeah, you have your hand up.
Another example of protectionism that I could think of is the way shipping is done in the US. So within the US, from port to port, you can only move goods through American flagged vessels. An example like Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, where I spend part of my year, most of the material resources that come into the country have to be on American ships. So we have to pay some of the highest prices for shipping cost and the tariffs that are added to those products. Whereas if we could receive products from other countries directly, we could get them at a greatly discounted. So the island of Puerto Rico is subjected to these astronomical costs of U.S. shipping, and that protects only the invested people, the shipping companies, and the suppliers who furnish all these goods to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, that's a great example. And right, so the benefit is is twofold, right? US capitalists or manufacturers can benefit from like having a bigger market, a bigger domestic market for their goods. But then if people do choose to buy internationally, then the tariff is a tax that the government profits from. So in either case, like usually the argument is that protectionism is bad for consumers. And I don't want to kind of dwell too much on this, but yeah, I hope these examples are helping people wrap their heads around this a little bit, because it's yeah, it can be very abstract. Okay. So throughout our discussion, there have been a couple of times where people asked, does this count as original accumulation? Does that count as original accumulation? And I'm really curious, as you did this reading and as you kind of talked in your groups, what are some other examples that came to mind? Do you sort of feel like you see examples of original accumulation still going on today? Or does it sort of feel like a concept that is a little bit more at home in the sort of historical framework that Marx is writing about? Christina, and then Shay.
Yeah, I feel like in our group, we had two different but very similar examples of sort of like the tenant landlord relationship where there's like a separation of ownership of the rented space. And then also like there is no real we mostly talked about the exploitation of like raising rent. But when I'm thinking of original accumulation, in particular, I'm thinking of my former workplace where there was like this derelict historic building that was taken up by these folks who like obviously had the means to like refurbish it, bring it back up to code, and then open it up to tenant rental. Um, and just how there's like this history of like these like quote unquote well-meaning people who like go into areas of like I'm calling from like the south side of Chicago. But like there are these people who sort of like on paper have this facade of like, oh, we're doing it to like, offer like rental space for the community. And then it's like the people who actually can afford to participate in that structure are not people from the community that like they're occupying, I guess. Um, but does that sort of like does that make follow the like definition of original accumulation?
Yeah. So I think Marx was very clear that for him, original accumulation was the prehistory of capitalist accumulation. But a lot of Marxist theorists today, you look at examples exactly like the one that you're sharing and sort of gentrification in urban spaces, but then increasingly in non-urban spaces as an example um, of original accumulation that is happening alongside of capitalist accumulation, right? Because um, what is more exemplary of cutting someone off from a means of surviving outside of selling their labor than threatening the place where they live, right? Or kind of making that subject to erratic and massive price increases in the form of raising rent. So yeah, I think that's definitely one that that uh, that is really important for thinking about original accumulation today. Shay?
The more I think about my example, the less I think it might apply, but I'll kind of go with it. So I work in healthcare. We didn't really get to this, by the way, in our conversation, but we did bring up like, child labor in other countries and how we benefit from that. But specifically, like I work in healthcare and I can't help but see this increasing, like utilizing tools and data management to sort of leverage, like the doctor patient relationship and put like a big old corporation in between those two entities. I see that kind of happening more so than ever. And it's more pushing people into a model of shelling out more money for their healthcare costs at the expense of interrupting a continuity of care or even, destabilizing the existing care system that exists. Whether it's, companies, again, utilizing tools and data management to, um, build people who utilize public health care like Medicare and Medicaid for services that they may or may not need, or even simply um, utilizing that information to sort of, again, disrupt any continuity of care, which would in turn drive down costs for everyone. Instead, people are having to get really bad, develop a phobia of going to the doctor for the risk of, again, this outrageous bill, or even, winding up in the emergency room, which um, is also overused, underutilized, and really doesn't treat people. It doesn't act, it's almost as if the system would rather you keep coming back to the emergency room rather than prevent you from coming to the emergency room. And they have to shelve that job out. They have to outsource that job to another place or another, side of the healthcare industry, which is industrializing itself. Um, I think even right now, I live in the state of Arizona. We spend a significant amount of our state budget on healthcare expenses. And a lot of that is just either overutilization or under management. Maybe, hopefully, that idea of like a corporation or a company being between a doctor and a patient could apply here.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example. And I don't know as much about the medical industry as I might need to kind of really connect the dots. But I think that what you're saying sounds like really generative and plausible. And I'm sure like if we were to ruminate on it, we could kind of find ways of fitting sort of all sorts of industries, including the medical industry, into this model of original accumulation. There is a book you may have heard, some of you may have heard of, called Caliban and the Witch by the Marxist feminist Sylvia Federici. And one of her kind of points in that book is that sort of like uh, like traditional forms of medical knowledge that women possessed sort of um, uh, like became devalued and sort of through like witchcraft witchcraft trials like violently erased in order to create this male dominated professional um, kind of physician uh, profession. And she sort of uses that particular history to try and write a new story of primitive accumulation that centers gender violence. So that's sort of an example of someone who's using the history of a medicine to kind of think about these questions. Uh, yeah. Okay. So I know Fanny has their hand up. Um, I want to quickly address a comment that Ian put into the chat. Why would gentrification be considered original accumulation and not capitalist accumulation? I think that's a really great question. You know, like my sort of off the top of my head response would be something like for like for Marx, even though he thought that um, capitalists sort of stole value from workers by not paying them the full measure of their labor, Marx was sort of working under the assumption that they would be paid enough to uh, um, to like sort of support themselves and kind of keep them healthy enough to come back to work the next day, which would include, a place to live. And so I think with the gentrification, it's that idea of kind of like literally pushing people out of their homes rather than merely raising the rent that starts to get into original accumulation territory. Um, I think in your supplementary materials, there's a video where the geographer David Harvey kind of addresses this head on a little bit. And so that might be a place to look for a more well thought out answer than I have been able to give here. Okay, Fanny?
Oh, well, I was gonna say an example of original accumulation, but after hearing you talk more, I feel like it's more of an example of um original accumulation happening or coinciding with capitalism already happening, because I was thinking of sharecropping from the definition, just how, at least from my memory of how it was defined, throughout elementary school and then middle school, um, with how um, formerly enslaved people would be working the land under the guise of being able to own some of the crops of what they were harvesting, but like not really, because the tools they used they would have to rent from whoever they were working the land, whoever owned the land that they were working, and then also the supplies, other supplies, to keep themselves well would also be lent technically, because a lot of them couldn't afford, at least from my memory, a lot of them couldn't afford to actually purchase these, so they would be renting like the supplies that they needed to harvest the land, but also like goods, sugar, flour, whatever they needed to live on the land that they were harvesting. That's what reminded me of original accumulation. I'm not sure if that's accurate now, though.
Yeah, so right, sharecropping is sort of this interesting example because it has characteristics of a sort of capitalist employer worker relationship, but through the way that sharecroppers were kind of intentionally kept perpetually indebted, it has sort of characteristics of like an older, sort of more coercive relationship. Um, so I kind of actually want to bracket that comment and also Ian's question about um, original versus capitalist accumulation in gentrification, because the kind of ambiguity and the sort of slippage between these two forms of accumulation is actually really central to the second piece you read, the Nancy Fraser piece on whether capitalism is necessarily racist. So I think our discussion of that piece will maybe illuminate why it can be difficult to put different forms of exploitation squarely in one category or the other, which is I know is a little bit of a cop out, but I think the next part of our discussion will be useful for that question.
And Justin, I think that Jessica's comment is also sort of in line with that. Will also be answered by that discussion of Fraser as well.
Oh yeah, great. Okay. So maybe that's a good place to transition. We're coming up sort of into the last 20 minutes or so of our time, and so we I guess we don't have time to break you up into groups again. So I'm just going to ask you to think about the questions that I'm going to show you in a moment on your own for a couple of minutes, and then we can have a discussion. So, I think this is the second paragraph of the first page of Nancy Fraser's piece. She writes, in all of its forms to date, capitalist society has been entangled with racial oppression. What is the nature of this entanglement? Is it contingent or structural? And what about today? Is racism hardwired in the deep structure of contemporary capitalism? Or is a non-racial capitalism finally possible now in the 21st century? And so just take a couple of minutes to think about these questions, right? How does Fraser answer these questions in her piece? What examples does she use to support her position? And drawing on your own knowledge and experiences, how would you answer Fraser's questions, right? Based on sort of your experience in the world, is a non-racial capitalism possible in the 21st century? Is racism hardwired in the deep structure of contemporary capitalism? So this is a little bit of a dense piece, and so it's okay if you want to focus on the third question instead of kind of trying to figure out the first two with just a short period of time. But just take a minute or two to kind of think about this, and then we'll come back together and discuss. Okay. So I know that was really quick, but what's your sense of how Fraser answers her own questions? Does she think that racism is sort of deeply ingrained in the structure of contemporary capitalism? Does she think that non-racial capitalism is possible in the 21st century? Okay. So I know that people are typing into the chat, but just in the interest of sort of having me talk a little bit less and getting some more voices into the space, if you have kind of a sense of how you'd like to respond to this, I'd invite you to actually speak up. Okay. Um, so Felix,
I don't think that we can have a capitalism without these divisions of race, class, etc. It's inherent in the system. They seek to separate us from and create divisions along many different lines, and that makes us collectively weaker. So race being one of those very strong tools that they use to divide us, I think it's inherent that racism and capitalism are hand in hand.
so I'm right there with you, and I do want to hear what people's own response to this question is, but right for now I just want to kind of make sure we understand how Fraser is answering these questions, which doesn't have to be the same way that we would answer them. Okay, Anum.
So some of the sections where I feel like she touches upon this is on page 5. She says that expropriation is a structural feature of capitalism. And then later on in the same paragraph, she says that the expropriation of racialized others constitutes a necessary background condition for the exploitation of workers, which I feel like to me makes it sound like it is inherent that racism is integral to capitalism. And she also gives some like modern forms of this, like prison labor, transnational sex trafficking, corporate land grabs, and foreclosures on predatory debt, which are linked with racial oppression.
Yeah. So that's a great section to pull from, because she does make this really clear argument that historically the expropriation of racialized people was necessary for the exploitation, the labor exploitation of white people. But Jessica also is offering a kind of a little bit of a different argument, pointing out that Fraser is sort of saying in modern capitalism, racial oppression is no longer strictly necessary because the expropriation exploitation divide has collapsed a little bit. Yet at the same time, she acknowledges that it still exists. And so I think you're both right in kind of pointing out, you're showing us that for Fraser, this this is a sort of complex a complex question, and one that she wants to sort of really give a lot of thought to. My sense from reading this is that Fraser acknowledges that historically capitalism has exploited the labor of white workers and expropriated populations of color through enslavement, conquest, dispossession, and theft. In other words, capitalism has relied on racial differentiation. But she argues that in the present day, all people can be both exploited and expropriated from, regardless of their race. And this is sort of leading her to the conclusion that maybe racism isn't necessary in the same way that it was. Right? She sort of says, in today we encounter something new, a form of capitalism that blurs the historic separation of exploitation and expropriation, no longer assigning them to two sharply demarcated populations. This form appears to be dissolving the structural basis for racial oppression that adhered in capitalist society for 400 years. So for Fraser, the sort of structural component of racism within capitalism was based on the idea that capitalism divided people along racial lines, and that division sort of determined how you could oppress them, right? Whether you could only steal their labor because they were white and had some forms of political protection, or if they were kind of people of color within Europe or the United States, or people in the like all over the world in the global South, then there were really very few limits on how you could steal from them. It wasn't just about wage theft. You could, basically do anything. Now she's sort of seeing this line being blurred. And if that line is blurred, she's sort of asking, is like, how does racial differentiation fit within capitalism if this line that has been so central is blurring? And so specifically, she kind of gives us a detailed overview of these different periods in capitalism's history to argue that capitalism relies less and less on racially distinct forms of oppression as time goes on. She sort of begins by saying in the 20th century, we see a blending of exploitation and expropriation, sort of both among workers of color in the global North. And this is where she uses the example of Jim Crow and sharecropping, right? Sort of people who are technically citizens and technically working for a wage, but who do not have the same protections as white Americans, and thus sort of are both exploited and expropriated from. She also uses the example of post-colonial citizens in the global South. So people who have gained sovereignty and are no longer colonial subjects, but who similarly occupy this sort of dual position as being exploited and expropriated from. And then finally, she goes, she moves on to the 21st century, where she argues that the expansion of finance, capitalism, and debt burdens mean that globally, more and more people are subject to both labor exploitation and expropriation in the form of theft, displacement, and subsistence wages. I think it's important to note that Fraser is not like she's not trying to make an argument about color blindness. She's not trying to make an argument that like you're somehow better off if you're able to be both exploited and expropriated from. She's, I think, noting that um, more and more people who maybe in the past would have only been subject to expropriation are now kind of captured by capitalist wage relations in various ways, but they're also still subject to lingering forms of expropriation. Now, on the other hand, people who previously might have been protected from some of the most violent forms of expropriation and whose sort of primary form of being oppressed by capitalism was through selling their labor to a capitalist and being paid less than their worth. Those people too are now subject to increasing forms of expropriation. And so she's sort of seeing these categories as becoming blended and asking, well, if they're blended, then how do we make sense of how race fits in sort of structurally, right? Is racial differentiation, is racism still absolutely necessary, or has capitalism evolved to a point where you can basically do anything to anyone, even if uh, some people are still more vulnerable than others. So again, we definitely don't have to agree with Fraser, but I don't want I don't want anyone to sort of think that she's trying to say that race doesn't matter, which is definitely not the point of her argument. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left, but I think it would be a good place to end sort of your own thoughts on whether or not race is still sort of structurally integral to how capitalism functions. I think Felix gave us a really great example of how we might argue that of course it's necessary, right? Um, if if workers weren't kind of divided along racial lines, then why hasn't there been a revolution already? That this has sort of been one of the primary tools of kind of keeping populations thinking that they're different from one another. Does anyone else sort of have some quick thoughts on this question?
I have a thought. I guess I feel like her argument is like missing something, or it needs another framework or theory to sort of explain that. I think it could be true that the structure is no longer dependent on or that it's crumbling its dependency on racial alienation, but still thrives because of it. And because it seems like our political consciousness n- is still sort of just trying just to arrive at the accountability, the repair, the responsibility of, centuries of oppression, particularly with respect to anti-Black racism in the US. And as new cries of oppression are coming out against capitalism, there's sort of this war fog. And I just don't know if I just think it just seems like something's missing, like it's sort of insufficient to explain this resistance that still falls along the lines of racial anonymity. So I agree that she's not doing this like color blindness approach, but I think there's a reason why we haven't sort of moved past or are stuck between um, uh, recognizing that things are a little different now. So maybe we can sort of build some solidarity or, so forth. But I do feel like we're missing a point of analysis that doesn't quite speak to this like reckoning that we haven't happened because of this sort of racial animosity that still is just so deeply grounded in this sort of base structure of capitalism that it continues to reinforce. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully said. Yeah, it's like there, like if we were to just agree with Fraser, the conclusion is almost then, since capitalism can exploit anyone in any sort of way now, then any form of racial animosity is just now like, I don't know, like purely psychic, purely a personality trait, purely a belief if it doesn't have a kind of structural basis in how you're like ranked in the hierarchy of value under capitalism. And I just, yeah, I think you're right that that's not quite true. And of course, like the past year of horrific violence in Palestine and now Lebanon and any other kind of forms of ongoing colonial violence with the aim of sort of enriching nations and corporations, I think sort of shows us that Fraser maybe isn't grasping the whole picture, even though I think it's a really useful piece to think alongside. Okay. So I know that there's sort of more comments and more hands, but we are sort of at the end of our time. I don't want people to go over, and so that's kind of a great thought to end on.
Thanks so much, Justin. Can we show some love for Justin to spending time with us today? And before everyone goes, there will be a kind of a closeout. We just want to run that poll we do at the end of each class. If you could just quickly answer those questions, and then we'll just spend a minute, Chica, if you can preview what we'll be talking about next week while I run the poll, that'd be great.
Okay, yeah. Thanks so much, Justin. And thanks everyone for your engagement with this very complex conversation. Next week, we will be diving into Marxist philosophy. So that will be an exploration of metaphysics and materialism, and also dialectical and historical materialism, which are very foundational concepts for Marxism. And I think that you'll have a great experience of reading the material and beginning to see examples of what's shared there in everyday life. I always find this to be a wonderful class. It's my favorite unit that we do. And I think it can be kind of like mind expanding, eye opening once you get into it. So I encourage everyone to give it your time and attention when you go through the materials. And we'll have a nice class next week on all of that material. That'll be led by myself and Thomas.
Great, y'all. So again, if you can just fill it out, a reminder that Chica has office hours. And Chica, when are you doing office hours again? Can you?
I'm doing office hours Tuesday afternoons, Pacific time 3:30 to 5. If that's a time window that doesn't work for you, no problem. Just send me an email or text and we can set up something that works better. We can figure something out.
Yeah, so we're, just about halfway through this 6-week series of classes on Marxism 101. So it's a good time to check in with us about how you're doing. And so if you have any questions or you're struggling through any material, office hours are a great way to tap in. And also you can also send us an email and just kind of let us know where you're at. But it was we enjoy we really have loved these first 3 classes and looking forward to next week's discussion. So have a good Saturday and a good weekend. We'll see you next week.